No matter how evil a person may be, there's always bound to be at least the tiniest bit of good coming from them. Join us as we have a look at some really great things done by some really horrible people. Adolf Hitler. Sure, he was a psychopathic Nazi dictator who hardly needs any introduction of all to his list of war crimes. His hatred, twisted thinking, and delusions of grandeur led him to start the Second World War, and subsequently caused millions of innocent people to lose their lives. But did you know that Hitler actually despised the act of smoking just as much as he hated the Jews? Well, he believed that the unhealthy habit would corrupt the strong and pure Aryan bodies of his fellow Germans. Thus, he started the first ever known anti-smoking campaign in history, while having Nazi scientists research the hazards of smoking. It's estimated that the health program he introduced saved the lives of about 20,000 people, which of course still pales in comparison to the number of lives that he killed with his other actions. Genghis Khan. In the 13th century, Genghis Khan and his Mongol horde set out to conquer the world like crazy. They killed, they raped, they pillaged, they burnt down countless whole villages and cities in the process. The wars that were led in Genghis's name killed some 40 million people, which is about 10% of the world's entire population at the time. But despite his brutality, the man was extremely tolerant when it came to the freedom of religion, and his conquered subjects were free to practice their faith. Places of worship were also exempted from taxes. His whole nation was also established based on meritocracy, and Genghis created a legal code which applied to every single person of all levels of society. Mao Zedong. This revolutionary fighter established a new China based on communist ideologies following World War II, which he ruled as an absolute autocrat. Millions of people suffered under his long 3-decade rule. He established a reform system based on cruel physical labor, ordered countless executions, and also caused millions to die from starvation due to his failed Great Leap Forward campaign. However, inside this genocidal dictator was a soul who wrote beautiful poetry. He also industrialized China, leading to it eventually becoming the powerhouse that it is today. The country has also never been invaded once since he established his rule, something that occurred quite often beforehand. Joseph Stalin. Now, one could not even mention Joseph Stalin's name without the gulags coming to mind. The Soviet dictator was a highly paranoid man who brutally suppressed his enemies, political opponents, as well as close people within his own party who he deemed to be threats. He sent millions to gulag labor camps, or had them deported, exiled, and executed. But similar to his Chinese communist counterpart, Stalin also wrote beautiful poetry. And you could say that at least the tiniest sliver of goodness is required in one's heart to write poetry, right? Stalin would also go on to help transform and grow his nation into a technologically advanced industrial superpower, bringing it up from the economically ruined nation that it once was following World War I. Saddam Hussein. This Middle Eastern dictator came to power through a military coup in the late 1970s. He was responsible for the death of up to 1 million Kurds under his rule. And that's just one of many in his incredibly long list of human rights abuses. His rule in Iraq eventually came to an end when America and its allies came invading, and he was subsequently hung in 2006. But Saddam was not totally bad. In fact, Iraq under his rule was still a lot better than the war-torn country that it is today, especially after the coming of ISIS. Back then, Saddam had a heavily subsidized healthcare system where basic care such as doctor's visits and medicines were virtually free. He also was a big champion of education and enforced school attendance, aiming to make his entire nation literate through literacy programs. Ivan the Terrible. This Russian Tsar was indeed a terrible person who performed countless terrible acts, with the massacre of Novgorod as proof of what a brutal and mentally unstable person he was. But Ivan was someone who appreciated art and literature, and often helped out struggling artists and poets by becoming their patrons. He also happened to be a very able diplomat who, through his efforts, opened up Russia's trade with other countries. Colonel Gaddafi. The ruthless Libyan dictator had an endless record of gruesome human rights violations. His people didn't seem to think twice about killing him, as he often did the same to them. But one can't argue that Libya was far better off with him ruling it, compared to the civil war that ensued following his demise. Gaddafi improved the country's literacy rates through free education and school building, and under his rule, Libyans also enjoyed free healthcare, free electricity, and subsidized houses and transport. Oh, and they also had no national debt. But his most impressive feat was irrigating his extremely dry country through a massive project that involved pumping water from giant aquifers from the isolated south into the populated north of the country. Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin, the man who established the first ever communist nation and put Karl Marx's writings into practiced ideology. He instituted the Red Terror in Soviet Russia, which was the systematic elimination of millions of people, including those within his own political party. It's probably no wonder why no one in history has been the target of more assassination attempts than him. That being said, though, before he came to power, Imperial Russia was ruining itself economically through its costly and meaningless involvement in the First World War. Lenin practically ended Russia's involvement in the war, and then saved the nation from impending collapse. He also created social reforms for his nation's workers, as that's what communism claims itself to be, the champion of the working class. Pol Pot. When Pol Pot came to power in Cambodia, he established a very rough dictatorship and naively envisioned a communist nation where everyone would live equally by all means. When his reforms didn't get the results that he expected, he resorted to punishing his citizens by depriving them of all basic rights, including education, medication, and food. About 1 million Cambodians died throughout his insane 4-year rule. It's really hard to imagine that such an evil madman was once a very soft-spoken university professor who was loved by his fellow students. Previous to his dictatorship, he always spoke of kindness and sought to reform his country. He entered a revolutionary war just for that reason, but ended up doing the opposite. As Harvey Dent said in The Dark Knight, you either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. General Butt Naked. Now, I'm not joking about the name here. This is what people really called him. Joshua Milton Blahyi was an army commander during the First Liberian Civil War in the early 90s, who was better known by his strange nickname, General Butt Naked. That's because he would often go into battle wearing nothing but leather shoes and an AK-47, believing that his nakedness was a source of protection. His crazy practices didn't end there, though, as he would often slay a little child as a sacrifice to the devil. He had an extreme knack for violence and was involved in rapes and disgusting cannibalistic rituals. Following the Liberian Civil War, he had a conversion after he says that Jesus Christ spoke to him and he converted to Christianity. Now he currently lives the life of an evangelist, spreading his message of redemption and forgiveness, and has also stated that he would face his crimes and be tried for them. These days he continues to spread the love of the gospel, and his church continues to grow. Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, some might revere Napoleon as a hero who saved France, but you can't argue the fact that he was an extremely ruthless dictator hell-bent on expanding his territory, regardless of the suffering that it caused. Because of Napoleon, Europe would go on to experience years of bloody conflict, and an estimated 3 million people died as a result of his campaigns, 1/3 of them being civilians. But despite all the suffering that was caused, Napoleon actually established a strict and rather fair law system in all the places that came under his rule. His Napoleonic Code supported equality of all men, ignored hereditary class privileges, and guaranteed religious freedom. This system of law was eventually adopted far and wide among other nations as well. But Napoleon's code did have its flaws, however, as it still failed to recognize women's rights. Emperor Hirohito. The Japanese Imperial Army was a merciless force during the Second World War, and one could argue that they were just as bad as the Nazis, or even worse. They treated people horribly in the lands that they occupied, and committed atrocities such as rape, forced labor, and massacres. And the man behind all of this was Emperor Hirohito. Some might argue how much he really was responsible for what his military men did, but he was capable without a doubt of exerting his control over the army if he wanted to. So what good could have possibly come out of his actions? As it turns out, he had a rather sane and decent hobby. Hirohito was well educated in the science of botany and marine biology, and published quite a number of well-respected scientific findings. The man was described as having two faces, that of an impassionate ruler in public, and the other an eager scientist in pursuit of knowledge. This has been a short look at some of the really terrible people that have done great things. But what about you? Do you know any scumbags who have redeemed themselves in any sort of way? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're here, be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video for more like it in the future. Thanks for watching.